From the idea of Druids sacrificing people in the Wicker Man, to them leading magic rituals in Stonehenge, they have played havoc in our imagination, and traditions of using them go back a long way, all the way to the Iron Age. But what does Druids mean for you as a fantasy world builder? How can you include them in your fantasy world? And what does it mean for your cultures? That is the topic of my video today. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Today's video is sponsored by World Anvil, which is a set of world building tools that helps you create and store your setting. Today we're talking about Druids, which brought to mind, for me at least, rituals. And in World Anvil there is a template to help you create rituals for your world. I created a ritual for my Scion role-playing game that I took my players through as the opening adventure of the game. I really like the questions that World Anvil asks to guide you through your ritual creation. If you want to use World Anvil, you can sign up for free using my affiliate link, and if you want to buy a subscription for World Anvil, you will get 10% off using that link. Thank you very much to World Anvil for sponsoring my content. Alright, let's crack on. First, let's talk about historical Druids. I must emphasize that all of our knowledge of Druids comes from second-hand accounts. The Celtic people to whom the Druid class belonged did not keep written records, at least none that we found, and so our record of Druids comes from the Romans, who did not see them as a friendly people. So, of course, there is some enemy writing the history kind of concept going on here. So take some of it with a, grain of salt. So all that being said, the Romans defined the Druids as a philosophical and religious class amongst the ancient Celts. Now, there's some unclarity about what they worshipped. It could be that they worshipped the sun and moon. It could be that they worshipped gods that were equated to the Roman gods. It's not entirely clear. They probably didn't build Stonehenge. We do have archaeological records proving that Stonehenge was built like way earlier. Stonehenge and the standing stones and all of those things were built way earlier in the Bronze Age, and Druids in their heyday existed in the Iron Age. So it's highly unlikely that they had anything to do with the creation of those stone structures. The name Druid may come from the Celtic word meaning knower of the oak tree, which is kind of a cool thing behind that, knower of the oak tree. But what did this philosophical and religious class actually do? So Julius Caesar tells us that they took charge of both private and public sacrifices. And he details that the Druids sacrificed people in a wicker man. Now, the wicker man concept is one where you have a giant structure built out of wood and you have people and animals trapped inside it, and then the whole structure is set alight. And this is a sacrifice offered up to the gods. Now, he does say that this is mostly done to criminals or prisoners of war, but if they don't have enough of those sacrifices, they might sometimes turn to their own. The human sacrifice element of Druids is somewhat disputed. There is some archaeological evidence for it, and I'll talk about that later in the video when I get to archaeology and Druids, but it doesn't appear to have been nearly as widespread as implied by Caesar. Now, Caesar did, of course, have motivation for presenting the Druids as barbaric, since he was selling back to Rome that, we need to conquer these people and bring Roman civilization to them. So he had every reason to kind of say things that the Romans would find barbaric, such as human sacrifice. But there is some evidence that this did actually happen. Now, the teachings of the Druids seem to have centered around teaching people to be courageous, and they believed in a form of reincarnation. They believed that when you died, your spirit was placed into a new human body. They didn't believe in like the cycle of reincarnation where you're born into an animal and so on, but they did believe that you were reborn into a different human body each time. And that had a certain impact on society that I'll talk about more when I discuss Catherine Kerr and her Druids and the way that she implemented it. But so far, I've spoken about Druids being priests and I've spoken about them being judges, But I haven't really touched on where this concept of Druidic magic comes from. So, Druids were also said to have a great store of medical knowledge. And this, of course, leads to kind of component magic and natural magic, because they would harvest herbs and create medicines out of it by brewing potions and so on. Pliny the Elder wrote quite extensively about their ability to provide cures for certain illnesses using potions. He also spoke about them finding mistletoe to be a holy thing, especially when it grows on an oak tree, and that it can only be harvested on the 6th day of the moon cycle. It was also Pliny the Elder who brought the golden sickle into this whole conversation, and the fact that Druids wear white robes and that they have to use this golden sickle to harvest the mistletoe, which they can then use in various potions. He also told the story of there's snakes that form a ball of like spittle, and then they have an egg that is produced from this ball, and the snakes throw the ball up into the air, and if you can catch the ball in a cloak before it hits the ground, it becomes this powerful magical component. So that certainly could have been an origin point for the mythos of Druids being component and nature mages. Druids, according to the Romans, Druids were also diviners, so they could tell the future. And there were two different types of divination. The one was where they gutted either people or animals, and then in the death throes of the person or the animal being killed, they would read the future, also in the way that their entrails fell and so on. And that, of course, leans into that more barbaric human sacrifice aspect. And the other way that they could tell the future was by looking at omens, looking at things like how the birds fly, home for the summer. And in that pattern, they could discern a future vision. I'll touch on that again, but Catherine Kerr used that in a distinction between her evil mages using the gutting process to tell the future and her good mages using omens of the natural world to tell the future. So a lot of Druidic magic was simply centered around them being healers, which is a lot of what we see in the older environments before people really understood science. If you could cure somebody's illnesses, you were seen as a kind of a magician. And Druids definitely lent into that whole environment, with then all kinds of additional stories getting told, like this mistletoe story and the snake eggs and so on, becoming additional tales being told about this class of people. Now, how were Druids organized? So Caesar says that Druids were exempt from taxation, and that there was one Druid who was made a chief of the Druids, and when he died, the other Druids appointed another one, or if there were several candidates, they voted amongst them in a democratic movement. There is very little evidence for this, as I'll talk about in the archaeology section, but it is an interesting thought for your world if you want to lean into that kind of international Druidic organization. There is some evidence that there were different types of Druids, so that the Druidic class was separated into bards, who were singers and poets, and vates, who were diviners and natural philosophers, and then Druids themselves, who were moral philosophers, who spoke on the importance of doing the right thing and living your life in a just manner, so that you can be reincarnated into a better position. From an archaeological perspective, the international thing, as I said, not really borne out by archaeology. There's not enough uniformity of worship across France running into the British Isles to really say that there was a single way of doing things. The Romans pretty much adapted to the local customs, and they absorbed the local gods and so on. So they would have brought a certain uniformity. But pre the Romans, that uniformity does not appear to have existed. There are, however, wooden figurines found in various groves across both the British Isles and in continental Europe. It is entirely possible that Druids did lead worship of the nature spirits and gods and so on in sacred groves, which they then placed these totemic objects in in order to guard the grove. And you can lean into that as a fantasy world builder and have, those little totemic objects be actual magical items infused by the power of the grove or the power of the gods. The human sacrifice thing is kind of shaky as well. So there are some evidence to it. There's like ossuaries and mass graves that do show that people were buried around some of these groves. But it could have been that they were there because it was the enemy being buried after a massive battle, or, fallen warriors from the good guys' side being buried in a place of honor after the fallen battles. Now, there is the Lindau Bog man that was found in England that looked as though he had been garroted and had his throat cut, and he had some mistletoe in his stomach. So it does kind of look like maybe that could have been an actual human sacrifice. But on the other hand, even that is disputed, with some archaeologists saying actually the garrote marks actually could just be liturgy marks from wearing a torque, which, the Celts are known to have worn torques as sign of rank. So there isn't really clarity on whether the Druids did or didn't do human sacrifice. You could absolutely go either way in your world. And if they have human sacrifice, that is, of course, a very dark thing. If they don't have human sacrifice, it makes them a much more sympathetic organization. So it depends on where you want to go with it. Okay, so if you enjoyed that discussion of historical Druids, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about some fantasy examples. So the first fantasy example that I want to talk about is Catherine Kerr. So in her world, Druids did believe in reincarnation. And of course, her world is built on reincarnation, so they were right. But because they believed in reincarnation, they became very arrogant. They said that you were born into the Druidic class because you are a better person, because you were a better person in your past life. And this gave them the right to, be the rulers of the environment. And in the end, the gods removed their magic from them because of this action, or the great ones removed their magic from them because of this action. And so Duomer masters, which have now taken the place of the Druids, they are forbidden to tell people about magic. They are forbidden to tell people about reincarnation to prevent such a thing from happening again. Now, as I said, Duomer masters are split into either the good guys and the evil guys. And the evil guys do practice human sacrifice. They use human sacrifice to fuel their spells. Whereas on the good guys' side, they use omens to foretell it. They use nature magic. They will have groves that have got special significance. And they lean much more into kind of the natural world as a source of magic. Whereas the evil druids, kind of force their will on the world by sacrificing people and using the power generated by that sacrifice. Another example of druids is, of course, the comic Asterix. I don't know if you've read them, but I love them very much. And there you have the druid Getafix, who brews this magical potion that makes people, superhuman strength. What I like about the way that it's approached in the Asterix world is that it is very much a component magic. So Getafix needs to have certain components to brew his magic potion. And this is actually a plot point in various of the graphic novels where he doesn't have this or he doesn't have that component. In one comic specifically, he needs a Phoenician merchant to arrive and bring him black oil. And the Phoenician merchant has no black oil. So the whole purpose of the little graphic novel then becomes Asterix needing to go to the Middle East to get oil from the people who are now residing there. That kind of component magic offers you a lot of advantages in terms of both limiting your mage, getting a weakness for your mage in that, they now have to have this item, and then sending people on a quest to go get the required component in order to solve the problem. In most of these cases, you have druids more living in the natural world, druid living in isolated scenarios. But the Iron Druid Chronicles tells an urban-based story about druids. It tells the story of a druid who lives in Tempe, Arizona, and is millennia old, And he's just trying to live his life selling potions to hippies, and things keep interrupting him. What I really liked about this book is it's an all lore is true book. So there's a lot of lore that's gone into here, a lot of research of like making these things true. And then the way that the author used tattoos was particularly interesting, because you have the druid has tattoos on him, but they have to be in contact with the earth in order to have validity. And if he loses that connection, he needs to kind of refresh that connection to the earth. And then the druid in this case also has an interesting limitation where he cannot use his magic to kill another living thing. Now, of course, they do work around this limitation using their magic in indirect ways, but that is an interesting limitation to place on your druids, that they cannot kill living things with their magic, because it always makes for a sneaky kind of indirect use of magic then in using magic in a combat manner. And if you like that discussion of druids in fictional settings, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about what to do in your world. So, as I said, if you're going to introduce druids having sacrifices, bear in mind that that will make your society darker. So think about whether druids do practice human sacrifice. Maybe they have practiced it in the past and no longer do so. Kind of toy around with those various ideas. Then think about the effect of druids being judges. Remember, they were judges in the kind of Irish tradition. And you could lean into that and give your druids like judicial magic. They could tell lies from truth. They could dole out punishment through magic. And if you want to check out my thoughts around magic in a court setting, I did a video on that, which you can check out in the information card. If instead you want to avoid the judicial side, you can lean into the kind of ecological warrior side, have them be defenders of nature, and have them use component magic, be healers, be priests, kind of like the traditional kind of druids were depicted by the Romans. So think about all of those kinds of setup in creating druids in your world. And those are my thoughts on druids in fantasy. If you enjoyed this video, maybe check out my video on how to create a forest. And if you want to connect around this or any other topic of world building, I do have a Discord server linked down below. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.